the world is 6 billion years old. That is unimaginable. So think of it as a week. All through Sunday and most of Monday, nothing much happens. Late Monday night, a cell divides. Life has begun. Through Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and most of Saturday, life becomes more complex and more beautiful. In a barren universe, life on Earth is being sustained by an increasingly stable and complex biology. At tea time on Saturday, it is the age of the reptiles. At 3 minutes to midnight, man appears. 1 second before midnight, man the hunter becomes man the farmer. At 1/40th of a second to midnight, the Industrial Revolution begins.
It is now midnight.
She's a lawyer, but she's a good lawyer. We make fun of lawyers, but believe me, if you were going to be going to court, you'd certainly want to have Constance on your side. And basically, I'd never heard of Constance Cumbey. I'd been studying what was going on probably for close to 20 years. And I always knew I was missing something. I knew there was a force out there somewhere that was so vague. There had to be some sort of logic to what was going on in the world, but nothing really made sense. Until I came across a book that was called The Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow, and it was written in the early 1980s, and I read it, and it began to bring me into an understanding of that there really are spiritual forces which are energizing everything that's going on. So without further ado, Constance Cumbey.
I started sounding alarms on that. The sustainable development component was one of the things I observed back in 1981 when I started my research, and one of the things that alarmed me enough to actually drop 7 years from my law practice and sound alarms on the New Age movement, because I looked at it and I said, my God, this is the stuff of which Nazism was made. I found another line of books, and the books were by Baptists, Catholics, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Mennonites, and the books were saying things like, we need a new world order. We need to make this paradigm shift. Up until I discovered the New Age movement, I thought paradigm was 20 cents. A transformation. We need to see ourselves as part of an interconnected whole. God's ways aren't our ways. Perhaps He intended for us to call Him Shiva. And I started thinking I was looking at some very serious religious apostasy combined with some political elements. And to my surprise, I saw many of the very same books, same authors, same propaganda line, same cover. Everything was the same, except on the side of the Catholic books was a logo that said Paulist Press. And on the side of many of the Protestant books that I found with disturbing themes was a logo that said InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And I thought, isn't this cute? Here all the Protestants are being reached with a call for the New World Order by InterVarsity. and all the Catholics are being reached by Paulist Press. The books all sounded far more like each other than they did the respective teachings of their respective denominations. And I wondered, where were they getting this? I thought for the very first time in my life that maybe I should write a book. And I was going to call it, my original thought was, call it Come Out of Her, My People, the growing apostasy of American religious life. I had no idea I was looking at something far, far bigger.
So I'm always kind of intrigued when I come across a new vintage propaganda film. It's kind of become a secondary hobby at this point. And I recently came across a real doozy propaganda film called The Limits to Growth, which was put out by the Club of Rome in 1973, based on the book of the same title that was published the year before, 1972. And they really don't fool around. They just kind of come out of the gate and...
Our riches and our numbers burden the world.
Right away, it made me reflect on just the irony of how Christianity and the Bible and everything it says about the final judgment, that's what gets stereotyped as, you know, the doomsday mentality, doom and gloom. Like that's doomsday cult thinking to believe in Revelation. Come on, kids. Time for family movie night. We're gonna learn about the Earth, okay? But one of the main things that really jumped out at me when watching this film was this part right here where they literally pinpoint the Apollo mission / media rituals as the moment when humanity suddenly had reached this level of awareness about the finite resources of Earth and the urgent need to therefore come together as a unified humanity to address this existential crisis.
If you remember the dramatic pictures taken by the Apollo flyers of the Earth, standing out in space all by itself, no one after seeing that could deny that the world is finite. Then it's impossible for people to go on saying we have an infinite supply of air, an infinite supply of water, an infinite supply of minerals. Man must learn to balance his activities in nature against the regenerative power of nature, or he is inevitably going to join the Tyrannosaurus in extinction.
Like that was the moment. So even the Club of Rome themselves are acknowledging how landing on the moon, specifically the point of that image of looking back on the Earth, which they talk about over and over again at NASA, the overview effect being like a critical turning point for human consciousness. And even though the whole environmentalist narrative has, many times taken a back seat to other crisis narratives requiring a unified global response, nevertheless, it's been preached by the prophets of scientism in all the decades since the 70s, and now has, of course, more political and economic impetus behind it than ever before.
Computer models that successfully explain the climates of other planets predict the deaths of forests, parched croplands, the flooding of coastal cities, environmental refugees, widespread disasters in the next century, unless we change our ways.
If we are unprepared for the next advance, the result could be hunger and death on a scale unprecedented in all of history. What scientists are telling us now is that the threat of an ice age is not as remote as they once thought.
So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra.
These are are the 16 tipping elements, the large biophysical systems that we have scientific evidence that they regulate the state of the entire climate system on Earth. 9 of these 16 are showing signs of instability. Push them too far, and they will shift over from supporting humanity to starting to undermine humanity.
600,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every single day on the Earth. That's what's boiling the oceans, creating these atmospheric rivers and the rain bombs.
All right, you get the idea. I just couldn't help myself. Not exactly subtle. I'm not even sure what piece of music that is. Somebody tell me in the comments, because I couldn't... What composer is that? Where's that from? But yeah, they're definitely going for maximum dramatic effect in the opening of the film. But The Limits to Growth was spearheaded by the work of this author, Dennis Meadows, who was working at MIT, and in 1970 became the director of the Club of Rome project on the predicament of mankind. And the film was just, a documentary version of the book. And the book was just expounding on the conclusions of this report carried about by this project, which was all based on a computer model developed at MIT called the worldview model, which was based on 5 variables of population, food production, industrialization, pollution, and consumption of non-renewable natural resources.
Our book, Limits to Growth, was the first concrete effort using a computer to look at trends that unfold over decades, even a century. We were trying to understand long-term physical demands on the planet. And in the 70s, we were thinking that probably in the period 2010 to 2030 was when the planet would start to encounter limits. And that when you hit the limits, the tendency is to overshoot them and collapse, not to even out in a nice, orderly fashion. The book was officially released in March of 1972, and the inaugural event was a press conference in Washington, D.C.
To have this opportunity.
The book was rather quickly translated into 35 languages and sold millions. It was a phenomenon.
Here is what Dr. Meadows' computer shows. Since the year 1900, the Earth's resources, there at the top of the chart, have been steadily used up as population, food consumption, and production of goods have soared. Ahead of us, sometime after the year 2000, this computer study foresees calamity. Resources drop more steeply, and food and production follow suit. Population continues to expand for perhaps one more generation, then collapses calamitously as deprivation takes hold.
I remember the first time I saw that NASA picture of Earth taken over the moon. That picture somehow had the capacity to just wrench your mind around so you thought about things in a different way. Our curves did that for a lot of people. For the first time, they could start to see the future consequences of what they were doing now, and for many people that was really shocking. I remember the first time I saw that NASA picture of Earth taken over the moon. That picture somehow had the capacity to just wrench your mind around so you thought about things in a different way.
So yeah, they had the super advanced computer model already predicting the collapse of civilization, ironically enough, basically right around 2020. That's kind of the freaky part. It's a little bit prophetic in an odd way, even though it's not exactly what people today would consider very sophisticated. But nevertheless, when you listen to the speeches given by Meadows on the topic, it quickly becomes clear that what was being envisioned even in the early 70s was a completely different economic paradigm, and one that was imagined to be defined by energy consumption. 50 years ago, and they already had that concept very clearly articulated. And, these are the exact same global communist ideas pouring out of places like the World Economic Forum today.
We have to explore with different ways of doing things, because it's impossible to decide ahead of time which is the best. And in fact, no one way will be best for all. I'd like to see a little city or a little community with some farmers and some small factories and so forth, where the medium of exchange was not dollars and price set through bidding, but in terms of the energy and the material content of the goods which are exchanged. That might turn out to have some very undesirable consequences, but I think it would teach us something about our own system.
And so, while I was going down this little rabbit trail with Meadows and the Club of Rome and limits to growth and how all that ties into the current population control agenda and eugenics, etc., and how that really took a foothold in the 70s immediately following the fake moon landings. I think that Apollo wasn't even finished until the end of 72, so it was before it was even over. Basically, as soon as that Earthrise picture came out, this whole one world environmentalist economic paradigm was being pushed in earnest. And basically, all the alleged technological advancements of space flight and satellites and everything to do with that were seen as making it inevitable that we would analyze and quantify and manage all the regions and ecosystems and resources of the alleged planet. And more so that we would need to manage the Earth in a sustainable way, or else face inevitable extinction. Like, that's clearly the whole narrative. Without a one-world system, we're doomed. And it's crazy because in this Limits to Growth film, they even used this familiar imagery of the globe being superimposed over an image of a child in the womb, which I thought was just fascinating, and it instantly reminded me of the final shots of 2001: A Space Odyssey, where Bowman, he's finished going through the lengthy psychedelic ascension sequence, and then the weird, purgatory human zoo scene, at the end of which he finally goes into the monolith representing the quote-unquote alien, the advanced, it's the demonic hierarchy, basically. Because, 2001, it's all occult symbolism. He merges with the monolith, and then he's reborn as the Star Child, which then is represented by a vision of this glowing baby in a spiritual womb floating beside the globe Earth. So he goes on this whole crazy odyssey, this whole quest, struggling against runaway AI, and, I'm not trying to analyze 2001 today, but I've talked about that in the past. But I was definitely thinking about it. And because the symbolism really becomes pretty startling when you start to understand it in those spiritual terms, and you recognize that evolution and scientism and globalism are all ultimately just components of a very ancient pagan belief system, that's persisted right up to the present day. And in the broadest terms, it's simply pantheism. The idea that the universe is collectively God, and that all consciousness and life forms contained within it are different radiations and manifestations of the same divine energy that makes up everything that exists. And the radical shift that happened in the 20th century, and notably in the 60s with space and the countercultural movement and drugs and the occult and rock and roll and everything, the shift that was going on was where this ancient pantheistic worldview was coming out into the mainstream, but could be conceived of and embraced in totally non-spiritual, non-religious sounding terminology. Whether it's philosophical, whether it's scientific, whether it's, wasn't just like the hippies, the cliche concept of the New Agers. And, this was a big revelation kind of to me, getting into cosmology and the history of it all, and, realizing that atheism, there really isn't atheism. There's just true biblical theism, and there's pantheism, or polytheism, which is just a subcategory of pantheism. And so even people who believe in materialistic evolution nevertheless believe in they believe in consciousness, and this is where the whole pantheistic paradigm rebrands itself. If you believe in consciousness, but you don't believe in a separate creator, you have to grapple with what consciousness is and what makes you. And so, whether they even realize it or not, they've adopted some concept of pantheism or panentheism. And then and there's this incessant sermonizing by various prophets of scientism about what a calamitous fate humanity will face if we refuse to take, the necessary steps as a species, quote unquote, to mitigate the unavoidable penalties for our carbon-producing, energy-using sins, or whatever else they want to say. In short, it's a worldview where a choice between salvation or destruction is being constantly pressed, and that alone is, we're in the realm of religion there. Only the definitions of each of those terms are modified to apply to the human race as a whole versus personal salvation. But you play a part because you're part of the whole, and that's kind of what I'm exploring here with this whole concept of the relationship between world communism and monistic, pantheistic belief. It's like the most extreme versions of the carrot versus the stick on a worldwide level. And, as they were showing at that opening clip there, scientism effectively teaches that we're now milliseconds from midnight on the evolutionary timeline, where we must collectively overcome the ravages of, wars and dirty fossil fuels and overconsumption and overpopulation and, whatever else we got to do to avoid the extinction of our species, or in the very least the collapse of modern civilization and, setting back our evolutionary progress by centuries or whatever. So sustainability is therefore nothing more than it's a siren song. It's a word that assumes the need for a one-world system of government for the salvation of mankind. That's really, so sustainability, it's a buzzword of the one-world religion. And implied within that term, sustainability, is the demand that we must put our faith in the technocratic elite, or perhaps at some stage our faith in AI as a more efficient expression of our combined technological expertise. And that is how people look at it. It's just an extension of our collective intelligence, collective research, collective human efforts over thousands and thousands of years of evolution. It's just the next step. That's how they have to think of AI. And then maybe that's what we would have to do in order to survive whatever existential threats the technocratic system insists is, looming that day. And of course they jump back and forth all over the place, but they're all part of the narrative. But what is really staggering is how much the occult spiritual roots of this faith in scientism have been openly declared by so many figures involved with groups like the Club of Rome and so many others. So yeah, while I was in the middle of this rabbit hole on limits to growth, I happened to come across a video on the YouTube channel Magical Mystery Church. It's a great channel. And she was reading the entire book called A Planned Deception by Constance Cumbey, which was written in 1985. And the specific video I stumbled upon was her reading the final chapter of this book titled Networking the Global Vision, where Cumbey's talking about the Club of Rome and its close association with Lucius Trust, and how the creation of this global vision is absolutely synonymous with the initiation of humanity into an occult pantheistic worldview.
The Club of Rome continues to work closely with a number of occult political action organizations, including Planetary Citizens, the International Center for Integrative Studies, ICIS, Lucius Trust, and the Global Education Associates. Indeed, its goals for mankind reports United Nations goals were submitted by Donald Keyes himself. Keyes is an activist with Lucius Trust and a former administrator of that organization. Extensive documentation is included in the appendix, including a 1979 membership list for the closed membership United States Association of the Club of Rome. Pesce probably didn't know the closeness of his proposals to Bible prophecy, but judging from his associations, it is possible he did know he was reflecting the occultic inspired organic worldview. Quote, one of the greatest socio-political and economic differences between the future and the present is that the increasingly intertwined structures of the entire global system will produce a progressive convergence of the futures of all peoples. All societies will be bound together ever more closely by a network of vital interlinkages, which will condition their relationships with each other for better or for worse. Breaking these links will no longer be conceivable. It would throw the whole system into chaos, which no one would want, unquote. Pesce more than likely honestly thought this would usher in a time of peace and prosperity for life. But on close inspection, his proposals are more likely to usher Orwell's 1984 horrors than an age of peace, light, and love. If these links of which he speaks are truly unbreakable, individual freedoms are very much a thing of the past. Pesce's analysis also helps justify the establishment of a new universal religion. Quote, "The institutionalization of faith has not always had happy results. Certain points of doctrine have been magnified, provoking schisms, apostasy, and the denunciation of what are claimed to be heresies. The official truth has become impossible to question, and in order that it never should be questioned, ignorance and even superstitions have occasionally been encouraged. These structural inflexibilities and doctrinal introversions have helped to keep the major religions static, even when the winds of change blowing through society have made clear the need to move from one cultural epoch to another. As a result, it is difficult even for the most sensitive and profound theologians and scholars to break out of a system frozen into formulations, reflecting the past, a system that cannot adapt itself or its doctrines to modern life. Religions now run the risk of becoming a timid rearguard, detached from the problems and aspirations of a bewildered and troubled humanity. And yet humanity has a profound need for spirituality. The anguish within the churches, the call for a new ecumenism to free them from their narrow confines, the widespread interest in minor cults, and a return to a respect for nature, and ecological respect this time, are all symptoms of this need. They are encouraging symptoms, for without a sincere spiritual awakening, the renaissance of our true humanity will be impossible. What Pesce was personally expressing a belief in was an organic view of the universe. Again, this is a belief that we are all part of a whole. On page 588 of the Externalization of the Hierarchy, Alice Bailey said this was an essential teaching to prepare men's minds to accept their occult Christ and his hierarchy. James Webb found this type of worldview universal among the occultists he studied. It may be mirrored in the popularization of unity consciousness among today's New Agers, where they come to a realization that they are one with everything in the universe, up to and including God. The Club of Rome betrays its occultic orientation in its recommended goals for human beliefs. Number 1, a world consciousness must be developed through which every individual realizes his role as a member of the world community. Number 2, a new ethic in the use of material resources must be developed, which will result in a style of life compatible with the coming age of scarcity. 3, an attitude towards nature must be developed based on harmony rather than conquest. Only in this way can man apply in practice what is already accepted in theory. This is that man is an integral part of nature. Number 4, if the human species is to survive, man must develop a sense of the identification with future generations and be ready to trade benefits to the next generation for the benefits of to himself. If each generation aims at the maximum good for itself, Homo sapiens are as good as doomed. With so many organizations and so many prominent people publicizing the need for a new world order and an organic worldview, their implementation appear inevitable. Indeed, the Bible prophesied that it would come. Rather than a time for panic, it is a time for soberly considering the times in which we live, for speaking the truth in love to those so involved, and making our own peace with the Lord. Amen. The new order will not occur one day before God is ready, but it will occur. The Bible prophesied it. And, as Jesus told Peter, these things must be fulfilled as written. So they must be today. The best advice is that of Jesus. When you see these things come upon the earth, lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. It will not be a pleasant time, but even so, come Lord Jesus.
So that was just a few segments that I strung together. I highly recommend going and listening to the whole thing if you're interested. So shout out to Laura from Magical Mystery Church. She and her husband, I love your channel. And she's got a lot of great videos on various topics, and I've been going through a lot of them, dealing with like New Age deception and a lot of stuff into the NAR and the more right-wing factions of the same occult globalist, bird. And I'm not sure if she came out of that sort of church background or what, but she definitely knows a lot about the connections going on behind figures like, Trump and Paula White and other false teachers. And I've really enjoyed a lot of her research, and yeah, she's got a cool style too. So thanks for all your great work. Keep it up. Thanks for letting me use some clips. And yeah, just lots of discernment with her coverage of lots of things. So yeah, I was pleasantly surprised that she recorded audiobook versions for both of Constance Cumbey's books, A Planned Deception, which you just heard an excerpt from, and then her first book titled The Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow. And I was just reflecting on how that book was probably one of the first introductions that I ever had, if not the first introduction, to the notion of a new world order. Or at least in any serious sense by somebody who, believed in the Bible. And I read that book probably 1997, 98, somewhere. And I'm not saying I necessarily agree with Constance on every, bit of biblical doctrine or even every single premise contained in her books on the New Age, but just as a blanket caveat with anyone else. Nevertheless, I just kind of had to stop and marvel at how, reading that book at age, 18 or 19 or whatever it was, even though I probably didn't appreciate it at the time, it definitely helped lay a foundation of understanding that would become quite invaluable in the coming years, over a decade later, when confronted with the stunning reality of just how much deception was being perpetrated in the government and the world at large. And, that this was something that had been going on for generations, and the whole goal of building a one world government and one world religion and bringing that to fruition. So here's another vintage clip of Constance being interviewed in the 80s. I thought this was like a good, if you're not familiar with Constance Cumbey, here's kind of a brief introduction.
The Motor City continues its battle with high unemployment due to a struggling American automobile industry. Yet the New Age movement continues to flourish in this city. A Detroit attorney named Constance Cumbey began to notice this in 1980 when she began a massive research campaign.
I'd go in there and I read practically everything in the store on prophecy and biblical commentary. And then I started noticing a different line of books that ran in their bookstores, and I noticed there were books from writers of many denominations. And the books didn't particularly sound like their own denomination, but they all sounded exactly like each other. There were books that called for the creation of a new world order. World Food Authority, World Water Authority, a New World Information Order. They would make frequent reference to the Club of Rome reports and a Global 2000 report, which was just coming out about the time I was heavily into this study. And the books looked very much like things I had seen in the old political world that I was no longer particularly active in. And it looked like what we would call a political platform. So I started thinking, isn't that interesting? Wouldn't that be convenient for the Antichrist? And I felt ashamed of myself as soon as I thought it. I said, well, these are Christian books by Christian writers. But my attention was riveted to those books, and I kept going back and looking, and I noticed the vocabulary was rather unique. Now, if there's one thing I've always prided myself on, it was my vocabulary. These books, things were done holistically. We didn't live on Earth. We lived on spaceship Earth in a global village on a very crowded planet. We all had to undergo this strange new transformation because we were entering a new paradigm. We had to have a new vision. Our old ways wouldn't do. Now that we were going into this new crowded planet, some of the books were saying that that there were truths in other religions as well that we should take a look at, that all the world's religions had the same central truths. And they were talking about courage for dialogue, and it looked to me like the dialogue was tilting heavily in favor of Eastern mysticism more than the Eastern religions adopting portions of Christianity. But I noticed that the books of the Strange New Theology had the very same vocabulary as the books with the very heavy political platform, and the books with the Strange New Theology would make references to the political aspects. I didn't start putting it all together until I picked up a copy of The Aquarian Conspiracy by Marilyn Ferguson. And she said that they communicated in the movement with code words and signals. She said the movement was large. She called it a great shuddering conspiracy, ready to overtake us. Page 37 of her book, she said in many different places at many different times, the kindling had been carefully laid for the real conflagration, the one that would forever alter the landscape. She said they had broken with certain key Western values, and whenever I hear that, I wonder which ones. And so I turned to her chapter entitled Spiritual Adventure Connection with the Source. And sure enough, she said, we turn east for completion. Eastern mysticism, direct experiential religion was the order of the day. And I had noticed that trend through all the books I had looked through. She quoted from the Aquarian Gospel, and I picked up a copy of the Aquarian Gospel. And page 14 denied Jesus was the Christ. Page 16 said one may enter fully into the spirit of the God of force. And that rang a bell with another Bible verse I'd learned, he shall honor in his estate. The God of force is a God whom his fathers knew not, Daniel 11:38. That's the King James Version I was quoting from. And then chapter 14 of the Aquarian Gospel prophesied that one day a mighty master soul would come to earth, a light greater than Jesus, to light the way to the throne of perfect man. So I figured that was a direct satanic prophecy of the Antichrist. And finally I picked up a book by Benjamin Creme. I found it in July of 1981. It was entitled The Reappearance of the Christ and the Masters of Wisdom. And it said, since July 19th, 1977, the Christ has been among us. Well, I had so many insane books from the New Age movement saying this kind of thing, I kind of disregarded that one. Put it aside until I was computer cataloging the collection in September. And I picked it up again and skimmed it, and the back had a section on how the plan is working out. Well, I had suspected that there was a plan, but I didn't expect to find an admission in writing that there was a plan. That was more than I ever dared hope for. And sure enough, he cited a lot of the components, things that I had seen in the Christian bookstores, even as evidence of the fact that the plan was working out. He talked about this move towards centralization of our food supplies and change of our economic system and of a new world economic order. And he said that they had hoped that the Christ would make his declaration by mid-1982 at the latest. And at that point, I skimmed through Benjamin Creme's bibliography in the back, and he had said he was an Alice Bailey disciple. I'd never paid that any attention either. And I thought maybe his bibliography was worth perusal. And he quoted from Alice Bailey at length and said he was her disciple, and in the back he said to read The Externalization of the Hierarchy. And he was right on target. That was the book to read. It was all laid out very coldly, repeated references to the plan. This book was written many years ago, between 1919 and 1949.
The Club of Rome comprises some 70 men of widely varying backgrounds, but their common concern is that the world problems cannot be solved by individual nations. I spoke with Professor Hugo Thiemann, director of the Battelle Institute, Geneva, Dr. Aurelio Pache, founder of the club, and Dr. Alexander King, director of the World Bank and the United Nations OECD. Dr. King, now you're describing the world as a closed system where all these things are interrelated, and yet the government, the control of the system is by individual nation states. Now, how do you convince them to cooperate?
The sovereignty of these nations is no longer as absolute as it was. There's a gradual diminishing, whittling away of sovereignty, little bit by little bit. Especially, of course, in the smaller countries where it's more obvious. But the bigger countries have to do a good deal of this by agreeing to international arrangements for the law of the seas, or for the limits of fishing, or for control of the wavelengths in radio, and 101 other things. But especially in the technological field, I think this is going to be increasingly so because of developments next year. I was at an important meeting in Washington a couple of weeks ago, and Peterson, the former Secretary of Commerce, was saying the same thing from an economic point of view. that the general world economic situation, the interdependence of countries on their food and fuels and so on, is leading to an interdependence which has seeds of draining away of sovereignty within it. So I don't think one can envisage an idealistic of jumping to a world federalism or anything of that sort. But the building up probably in the next decade in a number of particularly sensitive fields like energy, raw materials, the use of the oceans, space and so on, of a number of what people are tending to call regimes, which will not be ordinary United Nations type of organizations, but semi-management organizations. There'll be a great deal of consent in them.
Dr. Pichai, can you tell me what my lifestyle will be in 100 years' time? What sort of car I'll drive, what sort of house I'll live in, what sort of food I'll be eating?
Probably you will have a smaller car. You will use more common transport means. You will work many far less hours. You will have a wider cultural possibilities that today. You will not be so much pressed by immediate needs, because through technology, organization of the markets, the basic needs will be taken care of. And I think that you will love nature and continue then what I think you are doing now to protect our environment, to avoid this man-made world where the creatures of nature, the animals, the plants, the green spaces, the wildernesses are bound to disappear.
To the Club of Rome, the status symbols of the year 2000 will be the inverse of today's. Prestige will stem from low consumption. That personal consumption will have to be less is plain enough, but for that privation to be seen as prestigious would seem to indicate some radical rethinking, at least for the fat cats of the planet.
The fertility rate in the United States is now at the lowest it's been in more than a century.
That's according to the
data from the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics. Between 2022 and 2023, there was a 3% drop in the number of births. That brought the fertility rate just below the previous low from 2020, which was 56 births for every 1,000 women. Well, then there was another drop in births last year to less than 55 live births for every 1,000 women. Meanwhile, births continue to shift also to older mothers.
I just recently taken ayahuasca. I had just extreme gratitude for them, and then also a lot of space travel. You know,
space travel to where?
So here's what it was. It was people, the human beings that I know. They had this kind of, the best way to describe it is they had a glow to them.
Okay.
And then I kept flying out from them to see Earth, to see our solar system, to see our galaxy. And I saw that light, that glow all across the universe.
Okay.
Like that whatever that form is.
All right.
Whatever that,
did you go past the Milky Way?
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
You were like intergalactic.
Yeah, intergalactic.
Okay, dang.
Yeah. But always pointing in.
Okay.
Yeah. Past the Milky Way, I saw like a huge number of galaxies, intergalactic, and all of it was glowing. So, but I couldn't control that travel because I would actually explore near distances to the solar system, see if there's aliens or any of that kind of stuff. No, I didn't know. No.
There were aliens?
Implication of aliens because they were glowing. They were glowing in the same way that humans were glowing. That like life force that I was seeing, the thing that made humans amazing was there throughout the universe. Like there was these glowing dots. So I don't know. It made me feel like there's life. No, not life, but something. Whatever makes humans amazing all throughout the universe.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it was amazing. No demons. No demons.
So anyway, can I get that same experience in Neuralink? Probably, yeah.
So it's been kind of wild going back and reviewing the things that Cumbey was talking about in the early 80s. I mean, which is rather impressive when you stop and remember that it was before the internet. So all of her research involved finding the physical books and engaging with people in Detroit and elsewhere involved in New Age circles at the time, such as Benjamin Creme. And overall, it's pretty mind-blowing to think about how much of what was being warned about then has been manifested over the past 4 decades, or I guess 5 decades if we go back to the early 70s, when Apollo had just worked its magic spell on humanity, and groups like the Club of Rome and MIT began openly pushing the overpopulation narrative. And here we are today, speaking of MIT, with Mr. MIT transhumanist poster boy Lex Friedman talking to DARPA's own personal Tony Stark, Elon, you know it's real because it looks so fake, Musk, discussing his recent ayahuasca-fueled space voyage where he sees this glowing life force throughout the entire universe. And I just thought, what a perfect example to show what we're talking about. This new spirituality being communicated and interpreted through the lens of somebody who's all about evolution and transhumanism, and his whole podcast is about celebrating scientism. And here he is espousing what amounts to a pantheistic worldview, even while holding on to everything that quote-unquote science says about, evolution and quantum physics and simulation theory and, everything else, talking about the cherry on top being, do you think we could recreate this with Neuralink? And Elon Musk goes, yeah, probably. But there's no demons, right? No demons. No demons at all. And that, of course, is the lie. That, the only negativity is the negativity that you bring to these experiences within yourself. That good and evil are all just manifestations of the divine reality. And this is the whole insidious core of the lie of pantheism, which seeks to elevate humanity and elevate the creation, and they'll often use the word creation in the new spirituality, but in the context of we're all creators, we're all fragments of God waking up to the fact that we are God. And by elevating everyone and everything to the status of divinity, this is the same thing. This is the same doctrine that ultimately allows the technocrats and the elites and whatever you want to call them, all those who are working towards this plan of transcendence, to dehumanize and to enslave and work to bring about this goal of global communism, to the point where they're willing to sacrifice untold millions of people through all manner of ways in order to achieve this balance, in order to achieve this elusive, sustainable, level for Spaceship Earth. And Cumbey received no small share of criticism over the years for her research, and it's crazy how now we have guys like James Lindsay in many ways coming to the same conclusions about the UN being a giant theosophic cult, even though he's simply following the academic filtration of these ideas from Bailey and Blavatsky into the university systems and into all these government programs and things. But he's still not yet understanding the full reality of the demonic spiritual forces behind those movements. But the message they're preaching is, it's a theosophical death cult and sex cult and all the rest. The Club of Rome, probably far less known today than other think tanks and groups, but obviously the threat of a one-world economic system based on the goal of sustainability for the entire world, transcending national boundaries, is clearly closer than ever. And this is a very real and sobering, time to be living in. But more significantly, I would argue, is the undeniable expansion of the occult spiritual worldview of pantheism, or panentheism, everything being one, the universe fundamentally being comprised of consciousness, the line about being spiritual but not religious. The New Age lie is now everywhere you turn, even though it rarely comes in the cliche packaging that most people conceive of when they hear the term New Age and, think about crystals or whatever else. The term New Age simply refers to the belief in a coming evolutionary leap of human consciousness, resulting in a worldwide civilization that's in harmony with nature and with each other. That's all the New Age really means.
We landed on the Sea of Tranquility in the cool of the early lunar morning. The long shadows would aid our perception. The sun was only 10 degrees above the horizon. And while the Earth turned through nearly a day while we stayed, the sun at Tranquility Base rose barely 11 degrees. A small fraction of the month-long lunar day. There was a peculiar sensation of the duality of time, the swift rush of the events that characterize our daily life, and the ponderous parade which marks the aging of the universe. Both kinds of time were evident. The first by the routine events of the flight, whose planning and execution were marked by fractions of a second, and the latter by the rocks around us, unchanged through all the history of man, and whose 3 billion year old secrets made them the treasure we sought. The plaque on the eagle summarized our hopes and bore the message, "Here men from planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." Those 1969 years had constituted the majority of the Age of Pisces, a 12th of that great year that is measured by the 1,000 generations the precession of the Earth's axis takes to describe a giant circle in the sky. The next 20 centuries, the Age of Aquarius, the age for which our young people have such high hopes, humanity may begin to understand its most baffling mystery. Where are we going?
Finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you, to me indeed, is not grievous, but for you it is safe. Beware of dogs. Beware of evil workers. Beware of the concision. For we are the circumcision, which worship God in the Spirit, and rejoice in Christ Jesus, and have no confidence in the flesh. Though I might also have confidence in the flesh. If any other man thinketh that he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more. Circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of the Hebrews. As touching the law, a Pharisee. Concerning zeal, persecuting the church. Touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. But what things were gained to me, those I counted loss for Christ. Yea, doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I have suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ, and be found in him, not having mine own righteousness, which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is of God by faith, that I may know him, and the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death. If by any means I might attain unto the resurrection of the dead. Not as though I had already attained, either were already perfect, but I follow after, if that I may apprehend that for which also I am apprehended of Christ Jesus. Brethren, I count not myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forth unto those things which are before. I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. Let us therefore, as many as be perfect, be thus minded. And if in anything ye be otherwise minded, God shall reveal even this unto you. Nevertheless, whereto we have already attained, let us walk by the same rule, let us mind the same thing. Brethren, be followers together of me, and mark them which walk so as ye have us for an ensample. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things. For our conversation is in heaven, from whence also we look for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall change our vile body, that it may be fashioned like unto his glorious body, according to the working whereby he is able even to subdue all things unto himself.